Hi folks, Seth Leapson here. Thanks for watching my monologue. In these uncertain times, you may be thinking about personal protection. If you are, I urge you to visit my friends at Guns Etc. They'll help you find the perfect protection for yourself and your family, and they can even teach you how to use it. They've been protecting Arizonans for over 33 years, and they stand for the great principles this country was founded upon. Or you can just click on gunsetcetera.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back. Wednesday, January 6, 2020. I cobbled this together last minute given breaking news. I hope it works. Set aside my usual monologue to do this. In July, Nancy Pelosi was asked about violent rioting in Baltimore. And she replied, "People will do what they do." We denounced that sentiment and statement then, because to tolerate or excuse a riot is to teach that riots are tolerable and excusable. To quote Tom Cotton, "In these circumstances, the Insurrection Act authorizes the president to employ the military or any other means in cases of insurrection or obstruction to the laws. The Insurrection Act, a venerable law nearly as old as our republic itself, doesn't amount to martial law or the end of democracy, as some excitable critics, ignorant of both law and our history, have comically suggested," he wrote. "The American people aren't blind to injustice in our society, but they know that the most basic responsibility of government is to maintain public order and safety," close quote. He wrote this in the New York Times over the same summer. Nancy Pelosi responded about riots in the streets. Riots, we were told again and again, that were mostly peaceful. Riots that indeed were not mostly peaceful. The New York Times editorial page imploded over this op-ed, with firings and resignations for printing Tom Cotton's sentiment. But Tom Cotton was right then, and he would be right today, as I see what's taking place at the U.S. Capitol. As I say this, news is that the president has deployed the National Guard, and he has put out a message to the rioters: go home in peace. Maybe the New York Times can unretract Tom Cotton's op-ed right now. I still take my cues from Abraham Lincoln, who said in 1861, quote, "Our popular government has often been called an experiment." 2 points in it our people have already settled: the successful establishing and the successful administering of it. One still remains: its successful maintenance against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it. Ballots are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets. There can be no successful appeal back to bullets. There can be no successful appeal except to ballots themselves at succeeding elections. Such will be a great lesson of peace, teaching men that what they cannot take by an election, neither can they take it by a war, teaching all the folly of being the beginners of war, close quote. To rehearse something I said about a month ago, how in a Republican form of government do we handle a disappointment or loss we firmly believe the result of unfairness, irregularity, or even fraud? This question is not new, though it is anew with us today. It goes back to our very founding, in fact, and Abraham Lincoln was obsessed with this from his very first speech, his Lyceum address, and when he was president, asking, "Is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people, or too weak to maintain its own existence?" You hear calls of violence every now and again, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, usually quoting Thomas Jefferson, who wrote from France in 1787 about the Shays Rebellion, that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. This line horrified George Washington, prompting him to try to create a government strong enough in Philadelphia at the convention to keep this sentiment from running riot, if you will. Riot, good word here. James Madison was onto this too. as he put it in the 51st Federalist paper. A line conservatives don't much love, but it's there and it's important in its context. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then in the next place oblige it to control itself. In A New Birth of Freedom, Professor Harry Jaffa writes this about Jefferson's Tree of Liberty line. Jefferson's reaction to Shays' rebellion contrasts remarkably with the reactions of Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and other leading founders. For them, that rebellion proved a catalyst for the convention that framed the Constitution of 1787, a document that had no more urgent purpose than to provide security for property against popular passions. Property was being endangered in the states by the people seeking relief from debt, either through the legislature or by mob action. But despite his reaction to Shays' rebellion, no one was more committed than Jefferson to the security of property under the rule of law, impopular no less than in other kinds of government. Jefferson always believed that the people are the origin of the just powers of government, and that it is by the majority alone that the people can act. But in keeping with his view that an elective despotism was not the government we fought for, Jefferson believed with other founders in the danger of tyranny, majority tyranny. The rights of minorities, meaning the rights of individuals, were no less inviolable by the people than by kings. And he thought that popular governments were subject to corruption, and that resistance to corruption might be manifested in resistance even to popular governments. The right of revolution, often confused, underlie all the people's rights, and the fear was it might then be manifested either in violent resistance to corrupt or tyrannical governments or in the institution and maintenance of popular governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In the 1790s, Jefferson was frequently of two minds as to whether the government instituted as a result of the ratification of the Constitution deserved loyalty as an embodiment of the people's rights, or whether it deserved resistance for having usurped powers never given to it by the people. The transformation of the right of revolution into the right of free election began with Jefferson's own party victory in 1800. And we are reminded that Lincoln's first great speech had as its theme in 1838 the particular importance in a popular government for the reverence of laws. Lincoln stressed the necessity of obeying even bad laws while working for their repeal or reform, because disobedience to bad laws engenders a habit of lawlessness that easily can turn into mob rule. And when law cannot protect persons and property, men will turn away from the rule of law to despotism for their security. Indeed, Lincoln's understanding in his speech of the dangers of lawlessness for popular government, or of their inexorable connection between anarchy and tyranny, was substantially the same as the one that animated those who called for the convention of 1787. Now, all that said, I know a lot of questions are here raised, but let's start with a few facts of history, starting with that Thomas Jefferson himself didn't even apply his own standard to himself when he was president. As the great constitutional historian Leonard Levy writes in an entire book about Jefferson's violations of civil liberties, titled Jefferson and Civil Liberties, The Darker Side, Jefferson at one time or another supported loyalty oaths, countenanced internment camps for political suspects, drafted a bill of attainder, urged prosecutions for seditious libel, trampled on the Fourth Amendment, condoned military despotism, used the army to enforce laws in times of peace, censored reading, chose professors for their political opinions, and endorsed the doctrine that the means, however odious, were sometimes justified by the ends. Turns out it's easy to write somewhat irresponsibly from France, I gather, and less so to tolerate what you wrote then when you become president. A little different when you're in your own country, trying to maintain its existence or subsistence. For example, we have something called the Insurrection Act here. We do, as Tom Cotton said, and many of us wanted President Trump to use it to put down the riots earlier this year. Guess who signed that Insurrection Act into law? Thomas Jefferson. He did so after writing to his Secretary of State, James Madison, asking if he could use military troops against a planned insurrection, and Madison said he could not, and thus came the Insurrection Act, which would allow for just that. Now, if I may go back to Professor Jaffa for a moment, if an individual's discontent with a law is shared with a majority or a large minority of his fellow citizens, they may join together to resist it or to have the law repealed or declared unconstitutional in the courts. The best example in our own time of how these processes are related to each other is provided by the civil rights movement that culminated in the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and laughter. Here, civil disobedience, court action, political action, and finally legislative action all conspired to produce an outcome that, in all likelihood, would not have come to pass without the energy of all of them. Those same elements in different proportions have been present in all the great political movements and controversies in our country and history, including anti-slavery, temperance, women's suffrage, and even abortion. To repeat what I said earlier, I know there still remain a lot of questions. But one of the problems with violence against America is it will always be violence against fellow Americans. And it will not be successful. It will be bloody and it will fail if it is unrestrained. It is also inconsonant with everyone who want to revivify and study from Washington to Lincoln. As the old man put it, there is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law. Oh, sure, Antifa thinks there is. And BLM thinks there is, and one would have liked to have heard the denunciations of them from those who denounce today, but denounce today is right. It's just that we shouldn't think that there is an object of redress by mob law, not us. We build pillars hewn from the solid quarry of reason, sober reason here. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.